The committee will now resume its hearing into the Australian Government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. I welcome officers of the Department of Social Services, the National Disability Insurance Agency and the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission. Now, I believe the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission is the only one that hasn't appeared before us yet. Is that right?
Senator, we appeared before the committee.
I didn't think you were the... I didn't think we had the regulator at that one, but
yes, I
you would
answered
remember.
Questions.
Yes, we've had so many hearings. So I was just going to see whether there was any opening statements people like to give. Nope.
No, thank you.
Nope.
Senator.
Okay. So we've got until 4 o'clock with witnesses today. So I think we'll do the usual handing the call around. Can I go first to an article that's in the paper today? I'm sure you've come prepared. This article by Rob Harris in the Sydney Morning Herald. Are you aware of that article?
Yes, I am, Senator.
And it's based off questions, I think, answers to questions on notice that you've provided to the Joint Standing Committee on the NDIS. So based on that, and I just got the answers just to go through them, but is it correct that only one provider has been issued with one fine in the past 2 years?
It's correct that only one infringement notice has been issued as yet. That is correct.
Against 8,000 complaints being lodged?
No, that's not correct.
Right.
There's around 5,700 complaints that have been made to the Commission. I think it's important to understand that a complaint does not necessarily equal a breach of any requirements. People can complain about a wide range of matters. And
so the difference between the 8,000 and the 5,700 is that some of those 5,700 would have multiple elements to them, is that right? So they would fit into a number of different categories that you would assess against.
That's correct, and there are around 5,700 what we call in-scope complaints. So there are complaints that the Commission receives where it has no jurisdiction to examine those complaints and refers them to appropriate bodies.
Okay, so of those, of the ones where are out of scope for you, how many of those have they all been referred on?
Where something is out of scope, it is referred on to the body that looks after that matter.
Okay.
So for instance, we receive sometimes complaints about the NDIA. We don't regulate the NDIA, so we have a process of referring the complainant to either speak to the NDIA or to the Commonwealth Ombudsman if they would prefer.
Okay. And so can you just give us a bit of a rundown of where those, I'm trying to do it quickly on the run, but it would be sort of 2,000, about 2,000 that were out of scope, just over, where they went?
Just point of order, Chair. I just, are these complaints relevant to the COVID response?
Well, some of them would fall under that, for sure.
A relatively small number of complaints of the total number of complaints in the last year relate to COVID-19. There's a wide range of issues that people complain about, and a complaint is not necessarily a complaint about a breach of the Act. People might complain about, well, anything really. The concern they have about the way that they were explained something about their service provision. The focus of the complaints mechanism within the Act and the rules is to resolve complaints.
Yeah, sure.
One of the actions that we may take in relation to a complaint, if we're unable to resolve it, or indeed even if we are able to resolve it, what we believe it raises compliance issues, is to refer it on for compliance action.
Sure, and that was my question, was can you explain where they've gone? So you said you've sent some to the NDIA. Where else have you referred on
Oh, well, there's a wide range of organisations. I mean, people might contact us in the first instance about something that remains the responsibility of a state agency, for instance, and in that case we would refer it on to that organisation.
What about the police?
Well, if a complaint was included an allegation of criminal conduct in relation to a regulated provider, there are a number of mechanisms. So the Commission requires certain things to be reported to us as a reportable incident. Allegations of criminal conduct that are referred to us in reportable incidents are reported to the police.
Okay, so the police, yes, and how many have you referred on to the police?
I don't have the number of reportable incidents that we've referred to the police for this committee, but we report on our reportable incidents, we report on the number of complaints that we receive, and we include statistical information in those reports about referrals to police.
All right. In terms of the issue that raised in this article, though, so there's been one fine for one provider against 5,784 complaints. Is that correct?
Well, Senator, complaints don't necessarily...
No, I think at the beginning when I said 8,000, you said no. You said the figure is 5,784. So I'm now saying there's been...
Yes, but I'm making a different point.
Well, I'm asking a question. You can make a different point, but the question I'm asked is only one fine against one provider against 5,784 complaints.
That is the correct number of complaints, and yes, there has only been one penalty infringement notice. There are multiple compliance tools in the Act. There are over 700 compliance actions underway at the moment, and in fact in 3 of the Commission's areas of activity, we have compliance action underway with roughly 3,000 providers, and over the period between when that action was launched and when it will conclude, that may result in a range of things, including penalty infringement notices, but including other tools that are available under the Act as well. Compliance notices, we may condition somebody's registration. There seems to be a suggestion in the article that penalty infringement notices are the sole remedy for matters. Complaints are not necessarily complaints of breaches of the Act. There are a range of compliance and enforcement actions we take. There's about 700 that have been initiated, and as I've said, about 3,000 providers who are caught up in the scope of a number of compliance activities that the Commission has underway. 3,000
out of how many providers do you regulate?
We regulate in the order of, I might get Ms Taylor to give me the current number. We transitioned around 20,000 providers across the 7 jurisdictions that are currently under the Commission's remit. We don't operate in WA as of yet.
Samantha Taylor, I'm the Registrar for the Commission, and I'm also the COVID-19 Incident Controller for the Commission.
Great.
At the end of last financial year, so at 30 June, we had about 17,000 providers who were registered with the Commission. I would emphasise, though, that not all of those providers are actively delivering NDIS supports and services. That number is more in the order of about 9,000 providers.
Okay. In terms of the infringement notice you have issued, that was in relation to Miss Anne-Marie Smith, is that correct?
The infringement notice was for the failure to report by the provider who was providing services to Ms Smith.
Right. So as the Commissioner, do you think it's pretty low to have one infringement notice issued against, since you've been operating against the backdrop of complaints dealing with the numbers of providers and the numbers of people having care provided to them?
Well, I think it's important to look at the compliance approach of the organisation as a whole. That action is not the only regulatory action we've taken. We have banned individuals and providers. We have revoked registrations of providers. We've refused to re-register providers. And these are all important regulatory tools that the organisation has. I think it's also important for senators to be aware that the transition process into the quality and safeguards arrangements for these 7 jurisdictions involves really providers moving from very different safeguarding arrangements in states and territories, which predated the Commission's existence.
Yeah.
Some of those arrangements were largely managed through funding agreements. So there's been a huge part of the Commission's compliance work in the first phase of its operations around educating providers around their responsibility. When we see problems, ensuring that providers adjust their practices so that they are compliant. And as I've indicated, we have a number of large compliance actions underway that target a very significant number of providers on issues where we believe there are likely to be non-compliances.
So am I correct in understanding that there's been 23 banning orders?
I think that's, yes, that's correct.
So that's another one of your compliance, the compliance tools that you mentioned. In terms
Chair,
of...
with all due respect, I'm just again raise whether it's relevant to our COVID response or whether this is more broadly about the work of the Commission, and then whether that is better off being investigated through other existing processes.
Yeah, thank you, Senator Davey. We do have a wide terms of reference in keeping people with a disability safe during COVID-19, which is, as we know, we have representatives here who are doing that work, is part of this committee's terms of reference. So I think if you allow me to continue, you will see me join the dots. In terms of the fine that has been issued against a provider for failing to notify you of a death of a person with a disability, the article also reports that there's a further 200 occasions where providers have failed to notify the watchdog of the death of a person. Is that correct?
So it is correct that not all providers have notified us within the required timeframes, and one of the compliance actions in respect of the 3,000 providers that we're looking at across a range of activities relates to incident management and reporting.
So those 200 would fall within the 3,000 that you mentioned before.
Yeah.
So is that more of a timing issue for you in going through your compliance work rather than you're not?
When we take serious compliance action, we need to be able to defend that action. That requires careful examination of issues. It requires understanding in a detailed way what's caused non-compliance, and we are able to issue infringement notices up to a year after the date that the non-compliance occurred. So we have a significant process underway looking at a range of these matters.
Okay. So we've got one infringement notice, 23 banning orders. You said you've also stopped people from being able to register as a provider. Is that?
Yes, I haven't brought all of the registration data, obviously, to this particular hearing, but we do refuse re-registrations, and we have revoked registrations.
Okay. And you just don't have those figures with you?
No, but I can take that on notice if you would like.
Okay, thank you. In terms of what's the approach of the Commission in terms of ensuring compliance by providers against the background of a pandemic? Have you had to change anything you do or issue more guidance to providers? Perhaps
So-
that's one for Ms Taylor.
Well, I might start and then Ms Taylor can add anything that she wishes. Early on in the pandemic, and I think I gave evidence about this at the previous hearing, we issued our first provider alert in early February. That's one of about 32, I think, specific pieces of guidance that we've issued to either registered providers or indeed to participants. So a very significant part of our work during the pandemic has been communicating regularly and clearly about issues of concern to participants and also things that providers needed to know. That sits alongside an approach that I also spoke about at the previous hearing, where we've required providers to notify us of certain matters that we're interested in terms of how they are supporting people with disability during the pandemic. So registered providers have been required to notify us about a range of things, including those COVID-related matters that might cause a disruption to the continuity of the supports and services that they're providing, and that includes notifying us of whether there are infected participants or workers. So that's part of one of the regulatory tools that we have is the capacity to require people to provide us with information.
Okay, and are they doing that?
Yes, Ms Taylor might want to elaborate on the number of notifications we've received.
Yeah, thank you. We've received notifications from about 1,000 providers during the course of the pandemic since mid-March, when we issued specific guidance to providers about our requirements for those notifications related to COVID. That is a general obligation under the provider registration and practice standard rules for providers to advise the Commission about adverse events that would affect their ability to meet their obligations and to continue to provide supports to people with disability. We tailored that response for COVID so that we picked up issues around disruption that might occur because of limitations and restrictions arising from public health orders, and also, as the Commissioner referred, infections of participants and workers. That was an important consideration for us to be able to identify through those notifications where there are participant infections or worker infections or a catastrophic failure on a part of a provider because they can no longer provide supports to someone who requires those supports for basic daily needs and to maintain their health, safety and well-being. We've received notifications, as I say, from about 1,000 providers, although some providers have issued multiple notifications as adjustments have occurred. I might just reflect, having given you numbers of providers that we register and those that are actively providing supports. The 1,000 that have reported to us are providers of supports where there would have been a disruption to services because the manner in which they deliver supports would have required some change because of the nature of the public health orders and the social restrictions that were placed upon people at various points by state and territory governments. Not all providers would have experienced those kinds of disruptions. We do register, for example, a number of providers who deliver things like equipment, and those kinds of supports would, of course, not have necessarily adjusted. So we think that we're very confident, in fact, that it's given us a very representative view about what's occurred in the NDIS market, and it's enabled us to respond together with our colleagues in the NDIA where there has been issues for individuals where there's been a lack of continuance in the supports that they need to assist us in engaging with those participants, making sure they have a maintenance of support.
Okay, we will come back to that. I just sharing the call around my colleagues. I understand Senator Stoker, and then I'll come to you, Senator Lambie. If Senator Stoker is there.
I am, sorry,
Okay.
just making my video do its thing.
Yep.
Thank you very
yes.
much, Madam Chair. I appreciate
you.
it. So I'd like to ask, what has the response of the disability sector been to measures that the NDIA has put in place to support participants through COVID-19?
Senator, I might start and then Mr Hoffman might choose to jump in as well. So Catherine Rule, Deputy Secretary, COVID Response for Disability. Look, I think the case numbers of people contracting COVID, people with a disability and people in the disability sector contracting COVID are very low. And in my view, that's testament to the work that the providers have done. For the most part, providers have absolutely done the right thing in managing their workforce, managing the delivery of their services, and making sure the risks to both themselves and the people that they deliver services to are managed effectively. So I think it is a testament to the work that the providers have done to do what's been needed to limit the spread of COVID to vulnerable cohorts.
I understand that there has been proactive outreach being conducted by the NDIA to around 73,000 vulnerable participants across the country. First, tell me, have I got that number right? And if not, correct me. And otherwise, how was this received by people with disabilities and their families?
Thank you, Senator. Martin Hoffman, Chief Executive Officer, National Disability Insurance Agency. There were 62,000 participants contacted that required more than that in terms of the number of calls, in terms of getting through people and sometimes speaking with them more than once. And then further to that, in the Victorian situation and in Melbourne, went back to approximately another 7,000 participants to speak with them. Those calls have been received exceedingly well. Sometimes they've been resulted in actual actions in terms of amendments to plans, increases or rebalancing, follow-up, etc. But often it's just been the very sense that somebody is reaching out in that human way. And we've had a overwhelming number of positive responses to that, including from our own staff who have often volunteered extra time to do it, done it on weekends because they really see that it's connecting with the purpose of the agency.
Can you tell me, please, what was the purpose of the measure that was allowing participants to access supports through low-cost assistive technology under $1,500 in value?
Yes, Senator. So there's always been the use of assistive technology, and we have different bands in terms of its cost, in terms of the amount of cost justification or quote validation that's required. Less than $1,500 is one of those bands. What you're specifically referring to is the arrangement to allow the use of those funds for iPads and other communications devices, really seeking to allow the continuity of delivery of service via tele-delivery when people are not able to do that face-to-face. And so there's been a take-up of that arrangement. And a number of providers, as Ms. Rule was saying, have reacted very innovatively in terms of the sorts of delivery mechanisms that they've used to continue contact with people.
To tell me anything about the rates of take-up of that opportunity?
I don't have because it's within that band of allocation of AT, up to $1,500 rather than a specific line item for iPads. I don't to hand have the exact numbers. I'm happy to take that on notice, Senator. What I can say, though, is that in general, through this period, the rate of service provision has continued very strongly. So in the June quarter, the agency as a whole provided over $5 billion worth of supports to the sector. That was the largest quarter in the agency's history, and that is a sign that providers and participants are finding ways to continue to provide and receive supports even during the disruption of the pandemic.
Pretty well to my next question, because I was interested to know whether the NDIA has seen a significant or any significant changes in the patterns of payments to providers during the pandemic compared to the same period, say, in 2019. I'd be interested to know what claiming patterns remain the same and whether there are some that are different.
Yes, Senator. It might be most helpful to give that in writing, so I can give exact numbers and charts, etc. But let me just make some general comments now, if that would be of assistance. As I said, overall, we've seen a continuation of the volume of therapy, or the volume of supports, and in fact an increase in total expenditure through the COVID period. We've seen some rebalancing away from social and group activities to more direct daily support activities. So what do I mean by that? You could imagine that a group program might not be going ahead, but instead the person uses greater support in the home. Another example, a child might not be going to school, but they might be using support workers in the home to not replace education, but to assist with other activities. So a rebalancing between group and external activities to more direct one-on-one support worker activities. A continuation of therapy and even a growth in therapy services, again reflecting some of the innovation to tele-delivery of those services, and continued strong delivery of supported independent living, or SIL services, which is really the intensive, often 24/7 direct personal supports for participants.
Thank you. Madam Chair, how long have I got left? I'm just trying to think of whether I should go on to another topic area.
Yeah, no, I think you got the call at 2:20, so another 5 minutes.
Rightio. Thank you very much. Is the government aware of how many NDIS participants and workers have contracted COVID-19?
Right.
So, Senator, there's a number of ways you can cut up that data, but to give you the high-level figure, the cumulative figure since March 2020 is 354 people nationally who are either workers in the disability sector or NDIS participants have contracted COVID. Currently, our active caseload is 20. So 12 participants and 8 workers have current cases of COVID.
So what are the state and territory government systems that are in place to record the number of people with a disability who have been infected with COVID-19?
Might refer, so our data reflects the data that is reported to the Commonwealth under our regulatory responsibilities. So I can ask my colleagues in the Commission to report, to talk to that. State and territories also collect their own data under their public health systems. From time to time, the numbers, for example, to use Victoria, the numbers reported by the Victorian government, the Premier often cites some numbers in his daily stand-ups, are slightly different by usually 1s or 2s from the numbers that we hold. And that's largely because the states and territories collect that data through their testing systems, and that won't necessarily reflect whether somebody has a disability. That data won't necessarily reflect whether they're an NDIS participant or whether they work in disability services, versus the numbers that we collect, which are for the purposes of regulating the NDIS. So it's different data sources. So they tell slightly different stories, but they're pretty well lined up.
Okay. The last matter I wanted to cover with you is the question of access to PPE. The government committed 1.5 million masks from the national stockpile for the disability sector. Is it true that that included access for self-managed participants?
Yes, Senator, it is.
Okay. How is PPE distributed then? And how many masks have been distributed in total and where to?
Senator, the stockpile itself is managed by the Health Department, although there are dedicated email lines for the disability sector. The request is managed by health staff against the protocols for distribution. If the answer is yes, it's then provided to us as the agency, and we arrange distribution where it's required through a courier company. And if you just bear with me, I'll get the exact numbers of amounts that has been distributed. I think, thanks, that's right. Yep. So as of 7th of September, we've distributed 193,000 masks to 271 organisations delivering support to participants, or 271 separate deliveries. In addition, of course, these are the items. In addition, the Victorian government itself has also been distributing, particularly obviously in Victoria, and I can get a breakup by state and territory, but obviously the predominance has been to Victoria, particularly in recent times.
Thank you. I understand there have been temporary changes to funding arrangements to allow NDIS participants to use their plan funding to flexibly claim the cost of PPE. First, is that right? And if so, when was that implemented and where?
So for participants themselves, that has been implemented in Victoria, New South Wales and various regions of Queensland, reflecting the particular advice of the state government health authorities. And that came into place from the 29th of July in respect of Victoria and New South Wales, and then Queensland from memory, but someone might correct me, I think was the 2nd of September.
22nd of August.
22nd of August, yeah. Even earlier. Thank you.
Thank you. Has the management and operational plan for people with disabilities been updated since it was developed?
Yes, Senator, it has been updated several times. So it's subject to ongoing review as circumstances have changed in different jurisdictions. That plan has been updated.
Okay. How has the NDIA and NDIS Commission communicated to providers and participants about the government's health advice as it has evolved and the use of PPE?
So I think, Senator, there's been a focus on making sure that we reflect to participants and providers the advice of the public health authorities in their particular jurisdictions. We've tried deliberately not to replicate that, but we've effectively taken an approach where it's the role largely of the Commission to communicate with providers and of the NDIA to communicate with participants. So we've used a whole range of different channels from websites to direct contact to some of the outreach we talked about. As the Commissioner said, he's issued a number of alerts to providers. So we've used a whole range of ongoing communication networks to make sure that both participants and providers are aware of whatever provisions apply in their particular jurisdiction.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. That'll do me.
I'm sure, Mr. Hoffman, we can come back and you can fill in that whatever you're going with that. Thank you, Senator Stoker. Can I go to Senator Lambie?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I understand that family members usually can't be paid as carers under a person's NDIS plan. that some people have received exemptions to the rule because of COVID. Is that right?
Yes, Senator, that's a reasonable summary.
Okay, and how long can family members be paid to provide care under those exemptions?
I'm sorry, Senator, could you just repeat that question?
Sorry, how long can the family members be paid to provide care under those exemptions?
There is not a fixed or certain time. These are individual cases and it will vary in the individual circumstances.
How many family members have been given an exemption since March?
Senator, I'm aware of 2 cases, but I will take on notice to confirm that, but I believe that's the number that I'm aware of today.
So if you've only had 2 that are exempt, how many of you actually had that have asked to be exempt?
Well, to be exact, I have asked for the ability for a family member to be a paid worker.
Yeah.
It would be not a huge number, but a significant number. I don't know the exact number. We don't collect it in that way.
Because, so what you're telling me is you've had 2 that you've given exemptions to, but I have got no idea how many numbers have actually put it in for an exemption.
2 that we've agreed, yes, Senator, and there have been obviously many more than that requests. I don't have the exact number, that we don't record that in the decision making, but I can take on notice the ability to get you a closer estimate.
So yesterday, I'm sure that you're probably aware, in reference to the Geelong Advertiser, published a story about a Melbourne woman who was granted a 3-week exemption to be able to care for her disabled mother. She's a qualified care worker and she wanted to reduce the risk of spreading COVID by stopping strangers from coming to her mother's home every day. But at the end of the 3 weeks, she's been told by the NDIA that she wouldn't be getting paid as a carer for her mother anymore. She said, and I quote, "It feels like NDIA does not care about minimising risk to my mother like it does them." Is there any reason why you wouldn't be, considering what is going on in Melbourne, that you wouldn't be able to extend that period for that family member who, by the way, I say again, is already a qualified care worker, to limit that risk to another who is not well?
So, Senator, let me take a step and explain the background here. For a support to be paid, there are a number of tests under Section 34 of the Act that I, as CEO, or my delegate, needs to be satisfied of. One of those is Section 34F, that the support is not more appropriately funded through other general systems of service delivery or support services. For family members caring for a person with disability, the more appropriate general system of service delivery or support are the various carer payments and carer allowances provided through DSS. So that is the approach for payment to family members providing care to people with disability. And Section 34F says I should have regard to those alternate, more appropriate systems. That's the fundamental reason why, as a general rule, it is not something that is a funded support. However, the basis of the NDIS is to attempt to be individualised and customised to particular circumstances. And so where they're in the range of things that we consider, and that is basically, are there alternate options that can provide the support service, alternate providers who can provide the support service, and if that is not the case, and there have been a couple of those as I've mentioned, then for a limited period until those supports are available in this COVID period, we have agreed to it.
So this Section 34F, have any of the rules or regulations under that changed since COVID came in, or are you still playing with Section 34F that hasn't changed with the times?
Well, Senator, the Act has not changed. The Act remains in force.
Right. Oh, no. Okay. Should it? Should it not? I mean, we're going through extraordinary circumstances here. and you're still playing by all rules.
Well,
Senator,
Senator, it's a matter for the government as to whether the legislation
Yes.
changes or not. We can't answer those questions. It's
Have
a
you
matter for the
suggested it
government.
to the government? Have you suggested it to the government that
we
maybe
have-
34F is not working?
We give a range of advice to government on legislation, including throughout the pandemic. Have we given advice on that matter specifically? I don't believe so.
But Senator, what I can add to that, and Ms. Rule is exactly right, but what I can add to that is that we have issues of family members wishing to be paid support workers under the NDIS has arisen before COVID, where we, in the context of COVID, however, we've made some specific decisions, and one of the factors that we have sort of added to our decision-making criteria is whether the person with whether the participant is COVID positive or not, and that would be a relevant criteria. The other ones are about the medical status of the person, and we take advice on that, and that is also looked at in the context of COVID and the risks it poses. So Section 34F doesn't change. We're still required to have regard to those other services. But as I said, the NDIS scheme has objectives and principles about having awareness to the individual circumstances, and I think we've attempted to do that and have regard to the COVID situation.
So I'll come back to the original question. Why, if you have the power, why aren't you extending the period that family members can act as paid carers while we're dealing with this global pandemic? And why under these extraordinary circumstances, which blows me away, there's only been 2 that have been given?
Well, Senator, as I said...
I ask you that.
Senator, as I said...
I'll tell you why I ask you that. I've got a veteran in Victoria, I want you to hear this out, because he was under the NDIS, he had nurses, he had carers coming in, he actually called that COVID. So that's another example. So the safest thing would be if there is a family member and they are COVID safe and they're living in that house, then why aren't they being ticked off? I would have thought that was common sense.
Well, Senator, it's not necessarily the case. It depends upon the training and capability of the family member. Depends what else they are doing in their lives and where they might be attending. So it's not automatically the case that a family member is going to be a safer or in the best interests of the person. That's why within the overall framework, as I said, of Section 34F pointing to alternate supports, being the carers allowance and carers payments, we aren't stopping family members taking care of participants during this period. The whole scheme acknowledges and is built upon a recognition and support of the tremendous role that family members play for participants. But what we're saying is when it comes to paying them, the arrangement that is in place is the carers allowance and carers payments from DSS.
Right. I'm just saying to you, if you've already got a qualified carer, rather than them going out and working around the clock and they can come into the house with their mother and look after them, I don't understand why they can't be paid. But anyway, all right, let's move it on. There are also stories coming out of Melbourne about people with a disability being forced to make do without a carer once their family member's exemption has run out. What does the NDIA do to make sure people with a disability will still have access to care of their family member or when their family member loses exemption?
Senator, I'm happy to, if you avoid any particular cases, but I am not aware of cases where somebody does not have supports. We are very actively engaged with providers and directly with participants through our call centre and through the local area coordinators and our staff with individual cases, ensuring continuity of support. As I said, the volume of payments going through shows no gap in terms of the total amount of supports being provided to people with disability. In fact, they're at all-time highs.
How long are people who have qualified for the NDIS waiting in hospitals at the risk of catching the virus because there's nowhere safe for them to go?
I don't know that we can answer the question about how long at a kind of aggregate level. I guess one of the good news stories out of the pandemic has been the work that we've been able to do, particularly through the NDIA with our colleagues in state and territory governments, to expedite hospital discharge. The states asked pretty early on in the piece for us to work with them on that because they were making sure they had as many hospital beds available as they possibly could in anticipation of needing those beds for COVID. So we have worked very hard with the states and territories to get people out of hospital as quickly as possible. So, and I think that sets up some really good practice that'll exist into the future beyond the pandemic. So I'm not sure, Mr. Hoffman, whether you've got numbers.
Certainly. So since the 1st of April, 1,247 participants have been discharged from hospital, and that's up until the 13th of September. And at the moment, or as at the 13th of September, which is the latest data I've got, we're aware of 1,523 participants in hospital. 739 of those are potentially medically ready for discharge, and they will be discharged subject to finding appropriate accommodation. I should make sure it's clear that the NDIS is not responsible for accommodation provision for the great majority of its participants. Accommodation remains a personal responsibility in the first place, and then a state responsibility. But as Ms. Rule was saying, we've been working very closely with the states and territories to improve the coordination. We have a number of hospital liaison officers in each state who work directly with the hospital system and our housing teams, where we are responsible for housing, to expedite that process. So the rate at which people are able to exit hospital once they are medically ready to be discharged has improved significantly over the last 6-month period.
I think it's also important to note that we've worked hard with states and territories to make sure that people with a disability can continue to get the essential healthcare that they need during the pandemic. So if they need to be in hospital to receive treatment, that they actually have access to that. So I think it's been a balancing act between discharging people as soon as we practically can when they are medically ready, but also when they're not medically ready for discharge, making sure that they have access to the health services that they need.
Right. So how many of them are being discharged from hospital without having a home to go to?
Well, Senator, I don't believe anybody would be discharged with hospital being a person with disability without knowing where they're going to go.
Come on, I deal with veterans, mate. I've seen them dropped off at the front door and make your own way. They've got severe disabilities as well. So please don't tell me that doesn't happen. I'll be very, blow me over.
Well,
so no one's taking numbers, nobody's doing checks to make sure the people are getting discharged, they've actually got somewhere to go to. Do you have a plan?
No, Senator, I just gave some quite specific numbers as to the numbers of people we are aware of in hospital who are NDIS participants, the number of those who are medically ready for discharge, and the number who have been discharged successfully since the 1st of April. So we are tracking case by case what happens to participants, bearing in mind, as I said, that we are not ultimately the housing provider for the great majority of these participants.
So you definitely know whether or not they're going into a home when they leave. You've got that specific question, do you have a home to go to when they leave? You know exactly who's living.
That's the role of the hospital liaison officers, our hospital liaison officers, working with the hospital and working with state governments, yes.
The Royal Commission into Disability heard last month that the government's coronavirus response plan didn't include specific measures for the disability. Do you have any idea how that would have happened?
Senator, I'm sorry, you just broke up halfway through that question, so I might need you to repeat it.
Sorry. The Royal Commission into Disabilities heard last month that the government's coronavirus response plan didn't include specific measures for people living with a disability. Do you have any idea how that would have happened? That the government wasn't aware, wasn't woken up to the fact that they didn't have a plan in to include specific measures for people living with disabilities?
So I think you're referring to some testimony given to the Royal Commission by officials from the Department of Health. I think it's fair to say that early in the pandemic, people with a disability were not specifically named in the high-level plans that existed around the response. But that has been, it's not because there weren't thought given to people with disability, and certainly amongst the department, the commission and the agency, we had done a lot of work on planning what that operational response would look like. And subsequently, the AHPPC agreed a plan that was specific about people with a disability. So I think that's a true statement right at the beginning of the pandemic, but I think that's certainly been not the situation today.
So that situation's been rectified. So I just find it bizarre because you've got providers, was it 3,000 providers just set out there that had no direction from the start of COVID? We're just left in the dark with people with disabilities.
No, I didn't say that, Senator. I think Mr Head's been very clear on the number of communications that we've issued to providers, and providers have been very well aware of what their obligations and responsibilities were. What you started asking about was the broader plans that government had in place across the whole country, across all sectors, and that there was no specific mention in the early days of the pandemic of people with a disability. That does not mean that people did not have direction, because at an operational level that is very true. People did have direction. We've been very clear with providers. And I think the numbers of cases that we've seen in disability, which, as I said, is as of today only 20 active cases, is a testament to the fact that the providers did know what they needed to do and got on with doing it to make sure that risks were managed.
If I can just add briefly to that, Senator, the first communication that went out in February was to make all registered providers across the country aware of the global health emergency that had been declared by that stage. And the second provider alert, which went out, I think, on about the 9th of March, was again to all providers, registered providers in the system, setting out their obligations. That was followed relatively quickly with the notice that both Ms Taylor and I referred to, requiring registered providers to give us information about certain adverse events, including things specifically related to COVID-19. So those first three communications all happened in February and March.
And then I would just add...
So is that when you asked, is that when you asked what the plan was? And did you, and when you asked what the plan was, did you also point that out to Department of Health that there wasn't one?
Well,
where's your move in here?
I don't think it was...
Well, when did you actually go to the government and say, hey, where's the plan? That's the first thing. And B, did you point out to the Department of Health that there wasn't a plan early on?
Well, we've been working with our colleagues in the Department of Health and providing advice to government since the beginning of the year.
We're going back 6 months ago. Did anybody, is there anything official on paper to say, did you bother to go to the government and say, what is your plan here? And did you alert the Department of Health that there wasn't one?
Senator, we've been providing advice to government since the beginning of the pandemic about the response that was needed in the disability sector. So that's been ongoing. There's been a range of advice. As I said, I can find the date. I don't have it.
I didn't ask you about the advice. I asked you, did you go and ask them that there was no plan?
You just asked me about what advice did we provide to government. So I was just answering that part of your question. And the management and operational plan for COVID-19 for people with a disability is in place. I can find the exact date for you that plan was first issued and has been updated on a number of occasions since then.
16th of April.
Thank you, Senator.
Swap Senator. I just add to that, so that was the overall plan, and Ms. Rules referred to that. In addition then, I could take up a lot of time going through the actions that the agency, together with the Commission and Department, have taken to provide support, to actually do things for both the provider sector and direct for participants, in terms of both changing plan arrangements, direct support to providers, a whole range of things which have been operationalising or executing on that plan.
So when the providers receive the plan to figure out how to safely care for their clients, what date was that?
Senator Lambie, I'll respond to that. Samantha Taylor from the NDIS Commission. We provided advice to providers about their obligations to keep people safe on the 9th of March first, our first communication with them specifically about their obligations. That was followed up by advice on online training made available by the Department of Health to assist disability workers in infection control and identification of people who might be symptomatic. That was followed by advice to providers about, quite detailed advice about business continuity planning and what they should do to prepare for any potential issues with participants that they were supporting and how they would plan for continuance of support. We followed that up with various other pieces of information, including some quite detailed advice on how, in the event of an outbreak, for example, in a residential setting, providers should respond to that. In the meantime, as Ms. Rules described, there was work done by governments to establish a specific management and operational plan for people with disability as a whole community, not just within the NDIS. It's true, though, that plan does focus on people with disability who would have particularly adverse effects if they were infected with COVID-19 because of underlying conditions. That management plan has been oversighted by an advisory committee of academic experts as well as people with lived experience, provider representatives. It also has membership from all Australian government health officials and Commonwealth health officials. It initially met every 2 weeks to monitor the delivery of the actions across that plan, and those activities continue to be undertaken, and as Ms. Rules said, the plan itself continues to evolve as greater information comes available. And of course, the Victorian example with the scale of community transmission really has been, it's been necessary to adjust the plan to take account for that particular emergency.
Senator Lambie, do you have a final question?
Yeah, I do. Just one. Thank you, Madam Chair. Is it true that in the initial stages of the pandemic, disability workers and providers were required to source their own PPE gear? And if so, why did that happen?
Well, it's true. The National Medical Stockpile is available for where PPE is not available from other sources. So one of the requirements of providers is that they deliver their services in a safe way, ongoing, not just in the pandemic, and that includes use of appropriate equipment when that is needed. So there's been a range of things done around PPE. So it became clear early on when there were supply issues nationally, not just for disability, but supply issues nationally around PPE. We worked quickly with the National Medical Stockpile to make sure there was a specific process in place and allocations available for the disability sector, and again communicated that out to providers. But to this day, providers are still encouraged to source their own PPE. Mr Hoffman has alluded to the fact that providers can claim for that and participants can claim for that. But the National Medical Stockpile is really a safety net in case that PPE is not available from other sources. So we've done a lot of work on PPE, and feedback from providers and participants is that those issues that existed early in the pandemic have been resolved and that they have access to the equipment that they need.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Senator Lambie. Just going to the areas that Senator Lambie's raised, I think, was DSS involved in the emergency response plan, the initial one that the government released at the end of February? Did you have any role in that?
Not specifically, Senator.
Okay, because that's the one that I think guided the national response, and I think was raised at the Royal Commission as not referring to or addressing the needs of people with a disability. So you weren't involved.
I
that?
personally wasn't. I'm not aware of anyone else in the department being involved, but I don't believe so.
And then on the 26th of March, the Royal Commission issued a statement of concern which called on the Australian Government to basically develop a strategy to ensure people with a disability had access to essential services, make information available, essentially put a plan together. And then it wasn't until the 16th of April that there was a plan put together for, I think this one, management and operational plan for people with a disability, which I think was April, but it's been updated in June, it must have been.
I think its most recent update's actually in August, but we can
Okay.
we can check
well,
those dates.
This is hot off the press, so
Okay, we'll check those
hot
dates
off
for
the
you,
press.
Senator.
It doesn't have an August update. But do you accept that it seems to be, when you look back through the steps, and whilst there was a range of fact sheets and individual pieces of information, it wasn't until the 16th of April that there was a plan that we could go to look at how COVID-19 and the response and management of those was actually put in place.
I think that's true at the national level. I think as I said earlier, at an operational level, there were plans in place within the NDIA, within the Commission, and within individual providers having business continuity arrangements in place to effectively respond. So I think...
Yeah, but there wasn't an overarching plan. I accept there was
true.
things that sat underneath it at individual level, but this is the one that everyone signed up to now. And that's for 16th of April, which was, we were well into the first phase of the initial outbreak.
Senator, I think it's important to note the substantive action that was taken before the 16th of April by the agency, by the portfolio as a whole, including the price changes, including the $600 million of cash advances to the sector, including changes to cancellation policies, including changes to our planning policies, to extend plans to ensure coverage. All those actions and expenditures started to be made well before the 17th of April plan. So the plan's important to give an overarching framework, but real activity that impacted and supported people with disability was taking place well before then.
Yeah, but I guess there's an argument to say it shouldn't be an either or. The plan and those things could have been happening earlier, and certainly I think with this, there was, in early April, 70 national, state and territory disability organisations issued an open letter to the National Cabinet asking for a specific plan on pandemic measures for people with a disability. So there was obviously a need in the community that was being recognised at that point. But having said that, in terms of the Commission's information that's gone out, and I'm going through, there's a document you put out around your compliance approach. I think that was put out, it says June 2020, updated September 2020. Is that the first time information was sent out around the compliance approach the Commission was taking?
In respect of COVID-19?
Yes, coronavirus, COVID-19 Yes?
Well, indeed, the first communication relevant to providers that references compliance is actually the communication on the 9th of March, which set out provider obligations and the fact that the Commission can take action in respect of those things. Ms Taylor can articulate some of the more detailed information that's been provided.
It's not my
since.
question.
I can respond to that.
It wasn't about the date compliance. I'm not quibbling over that. I'm wanting to understand. What I'm wanting to understand is the content of it, where you say we are taking a proportionate regulatory approach with providers and are concentrating on supporting you to be agile and resourceful in meeting your obligations. And then it's vital that all providers continue to uphold the rights of NDIS participants and their need for continuity of support and services to keep them safe and healthy. So can you talk me through what a proportionate regulatory approach and concentrating on providers being agile and resourceful means, and whether that's impacted on your, say, physical visits and checks that you do as part of your compliance activity?
So, Senator, you're referring to the fact sheet you said on the 9th of June, is that right?
It doesn't say 9th of June, it just says June 2020 updated September 2020.
So I'll just clarify that fact sheet was giving case studies where we had already undertaken compliance action.
I know,
around
but it's
COVID.
got a paragraph ahead of that.
Yes, and I'll respond to that.
That's what I want.
So that paragraph is directly related to our compliance and enforcement policy that's been in place since the Commission commenced in New South Wales and South Australia on the 1st of July 2018.
So it's no change?
So the Commission, well, no. So there was a change in the way that we approached compliance actions during COVID. We centralised our approach to compliance actions during the pandemic because we wanted to be making sure that we had a consistent approach nationally to those matters, and we wanted to be able to keep account of the complexities of the issues that came to us around COVID, so that we could use those experiences to educate the broader market about what was what particular situations were arising for people with disability in the context of the pandemic that needed to be paid attention to and remedied by providers. So we did advise providers early on that we would be proportionate, which is we would take an approach which is about assisting them first and foremost in an unprecedented situation that I think we've all experienced, having complexities which were in many respects unanticipated. So our approach was to assist providers in understanding how their obligations applied in the context of the pandemic, and where unacceptable practice was occurring, for us to respond to that in a very swift manner. So a number of compliance actions been taken and have involved corrective activity that has caused providers to make some changes to the way in which they were approaching, for example, their interpretation of public health orders, which have been successful in assisting people to, for example, have better access to community where public health orders are made that possible for them. So we have taken a proportionate approach. That's an appropriate thing for any regulator to do, particularly making sure that we approach situations within the particular complexity of COVID.
Okay, so when I said, oh, so you haven't taken, it's remained the same, and it was in response to you saying, well, that paragraph is taken out of the policy you've had in place for 2018 since you began operation. That's why I made that comment. And then you've said, no, we have changed our approach. It's got centralised approach, consistent approach in terms of handling issues as they arise and to be able to deal with the complexity of approach. So
So the policy remained relevant.
How has that changed in terms of things like proactive checks of providers? What has that meant during COVID-19?
So the general compliance activities that the Commission undertakes have continued to the extent that they're able to where we don't, anticipate having, for example, investigators going onto premises where they might put people at risk. So
you did wind back your proactive checks that you would, you must have data on that, do you?
there were site visits undertaken throughout this period, yes.
Okay, could you give me those?
I don't have that number in front of me, Senator, but we can provide that information out of session.
You don't have the number of checks between March and September?
I don't have that number with me, no. But there were site visits that did continue to occur as part of our investigative activities over that period.
So can you tell me whether there was less proactive checks of providers during COVID-19? I know the aged care regulator, for example, did certainly wind back their proactive or unannounced visits during COVID-19. Did you make a decision to reduce the number of proactive checks of providers during that time?
So the advice that we provided the auditors that the Commissioner approves to undertake audits as part of a rolling cycle of assurance associated with registration, those audits have continued to be undertaken, but we have given advice throughout the period to auditors about ensuring that they undertake those audits, particularly where they involve site visits, in compliance with public health orders.
Okay. So can you, Ms Taylor, answer for me whether there has been less of those during COVID-19 than, say, the same period the year before?
Senator, we're not in a usual cycle of audit.
I know. I'm not trying to trick you or anything. I'm genuinely trying to understand whether that has changed.
I think it's important to give you some context. So the Commissioner mentioned earlier that we were in a transition cycle. So whilst we commenced in New South Wales, South Australia and then the other jurisdictions in 2019, providers go through a process of re-registering in order to retain their registration. That cycle doesn't enable us, because it's new in each jurisdiction by definition, to have a pure comparative period of audit activity across the years. But certainly, I think for sure we can say that there would have been a reduction in some of the audit activity that related to on-site, because of the need to make sure that we were limiting, or the audit bodies were limiting exposure for people with disability during peak periods in the pandemic, and where health orders would not have allowed them to undertake that work.
Well, if you could come back to us with what that actually translates to in site visits, I think you call them, is that the audit process you talk about, is that the equivalent of, say, an unannounced visit in the aged care sector? Is that, surely you have powers to do sort of unannounced checks on what's happening, particularly if an area of significant concern or risk is raised with you. Is that correct? Or is that another process as opposed to an audit?
So we can do unannounced visits if we want to, without consent, enter premises. We require a warrant to do that, but we do unannounced visits. And audits, as Ms Taylor has said, are part of they're part of the registration process. So at the moment, you had roughly 20,000, now 17,000 providers who had been subject to a variety of different audit arrangements in states and territories. When they come into the Commission's remit, that's through the application of a transitional rule, and they become transitioned providers. If they want to retain their registration, they have to be audited against the practice standards that were developed for the NDIS quality and safeguarding framework. What Ms Taylor was referring to is the progressive processing of all of those transitioned providers through those audits.
Yeah.
In addition to those routine processes, we may get regulatory intelligence from a number of different sources, including our own complaints and reportable incidents functions, but other sources as well that might cause us to either start an investigation or to visit a provider to determine whether or not we think there's a breach. And so, as Ms Taylor said, site visits connected to regulatory activities outside of the audit cycle continued, and the guidance to auditors around their own processes was very much around those processes being led by compliance with public health orders, and that's partly because the Commission's audit process for registered providers requires a proper sampling of people with disability who are receiving support. So in some cases that will mean that the time within which providers have to complete that audit will be extended, and Ms Taylor's indicated that we can provide the information on that.
Okay. So, I mean, just for someone that hasn't been involved, don't usually do this estimates. So, forgive me for this if you're if you're going through things you've gone through many times before. But in order, like COVID-19 has presented a particular risk to people with a disability, particularly those who are receiving care in their homes from individuals, whether it be through continuity of care or your ability to have eyes on what's actually happening. Who's at risk, how do you intervene, how do you respond? So how are you as the regulator convincing yourself that you have a good handle on what's happening for people, NDIS recipients, in terms of the quality of the care they're getting and their ability to raise concerns, or for you to be, to be investigating those? How are you convincing yourself in these times that you have that, you're doing everything you can?
Well, the decision in March to use the powers that the Commission has, and it's the first time those powers have been available in any kind of national sense, notwithstanding the fact that WA is still to transition.
Yeah.
I think when I met with industry stakeholders and also with organisations representing people with disability, I indicated in the second week of March that one of the things I thought I would do was to use the relevant information gathering powers under the Act and rules in order to require providers to give us information that is specific to COVID-19. And that was for a number of reasons. One, we wanted to know what was happening. Two, we wanted providers to know that we were taking a very direct interest in what they were encountering in the management of COVID, remembering, of course, that we're talking about organisations in the registered provider cohort that include quite large organisations with quite developed quality and safety sections of their organisations, as well as much smaller operators. So there was a decision up front to use both regulatory mechanisms as well as guidance from the Commission to make sure that we had an understanding of what was going on, but also that providers and participants, our communications were to both providers and participants about what they should expect, to make sure that we were seen as a source of authoritative advice. So while we did not provide the public health advice, we pointed providers to the relevant public health advice that they would need, in the same way that we pointed them to the information around PPE stockpiles, etc. And there has been ongoing compliance work in respect of some of the issues that we identified through notifications, but also where participants made complaints about various things that they were not happy about, or where they felt the provider could have done something differently.
The other part of the operational response that's been really important here, particularly in Victoria, because we haven't actually had significant numbers, very small numbers outside of Victoria, but in Victoria, twice since the second wave in Victoria, twice a day, 7 days a week, myself, Ms Taylor, representatives from the NDIA meet with our counterparts in Victoria and operationally go through case by case what's happened on that day. So how many new cases, what sites where there's a residential facility that may or may not be ours to regulate. So Victoria has a few quirks that there's about 5,000 people in disability accommodation in Victoria. Half of that is funded by the NDIS and therefore regulated by the Commission. The other half is actually run by the Victorian Government still and therefore regulated by them.
Yep.
So connecting all the bits of the system has been really important. So
when's that? Did you say twice a day?
Twice a day, 7 days a week since the beginning of August. We've been having these discussions.
Why the beginning of August?
Because that was when the second wave in Victoria.
The second wave started mid-June.
Sorry, I'm not. Under the current governance structure, that's been the approach of twice a day, 7 days a week. Prior to that, there perhaps wasn't the formal governance arrangements put in place by the Victorians. There was a rapid response group. We did have representatives on that, but as we became more concerned that risk numbers were going up and we were seeing more risks in the system, the Premier and the Prime Minister had a conversation. We ratcheted up the level of representation, including seniority at those forums and the frequency at those forums being in place. So we're very quick to identify if there's a provider or a site where we think there are risks emerging. We use the leverage we've got under the regulatory regime. The agency gets involved in dealing with participants. We've been escalating things as we need to. So there is also a very operational layer happening where we're actively monitoring every case and making sure that providers are doing the right thing. And if we don't think that they are or that they need some help, then we're pretty, that response is happening within the day.
I mean, beginning of August was when the cases were peaking at 700 cases a day. That's sort of 6 weeks into the second wave.
So the peak in disability hit in early August and was at about 130 active cases.
Just seems a little bit late, again, to be putting in place governance arrangements to manage something that's already, you're right in the thick of it.
As I said, there was a disability rapid response group and we did have Commonwealth representation on it, but it wasn't until case numbers started to escalate in the disability sector. So until early August, the case numbers had remained quite low, but then they took off.
But community transmission hadn't, which is the risk.
Yeah, so as I said, there was some governance in place, but we escalated that once the numbers started to escalate more significantly in the disability sector.
It's very similar to the aged care, where it just seems, again, reactionary once the numbers are at their worst.
Well, it's not similar to aged care in the sense that it peaked at 130 cases, so active cases. So the numbers are much smaller than in other sectors.
Yeah.
And in fact, the level of infection amongst people with a disability or NDIS participants in Victoria was lower than the rate of the general population, significantly lower.
Anyway.
If I can add to what Ms Rule just described, Senator, although the Victorian governance kicked in in the time period that Ms Rule described, the Commonwealth arrangements for triaging issues to do with participant and worker infection remained in place, and so there's been an ongoing and very strong connection between the Commission, the NDIA, and with local providers to support them where there have been infections. So that was already in place with regular engagement, daily engagement between the Commonwealth parties.
In terms of the updated, to the questions I've noticed, when you issued one infringement notice, that was up to the 31st of July. Have there been any since?
We haven't issued any infringement notices since then, no.
Okay, so that remains at 1. In terms of, I'm I'm going through them. In terms of banned entities, I think we had 23
As of what?
as of the 30th of June. It was.
Well, we haven't banned anyone in the context of COVID.
No, but has there been any further on those 23 providers?
I just
other
need to
related
check
matters.
the dates, but...
That was up to the 30th of June.
Yes, there
yes,
has
there
been.
has
They're, they're published on our website.
Are
We
they?
will provide...
Yes, they are.
Okay. Can you tell me that? Just don't have that. I mean, I can get the website
I
up, but
couldn't tell you off the top of my head how many of the matters on our register relate to post 30 June, but there certainly are additional actions that we've taken, which, are, as I say, though, are not related to COVID-19 responses.
thank you. We do have broad terms of reference.
I just
which
want to
means,
clarify that.
I'm very happy that you clarify it, but we are able to ask questions within that. In terms of where was I? In terms of the number of people, NDIS recipients who have died from COVID-19, I note you said 300 and I note the clarification on the numbers that you gave before, but you said 354 workers or participants. Do you have a number of those who might have passed away?
8 NDIS participants have passed away while infected with COVID-19.
Right.
I think that's an important distinction. Not all of them passed away of COVID-19.
Yes.
So there are 6 in Victoria and 2 individuals who passed away in New South Wales.
And no workers then?
We're aware of 1 worker who had passed away, but that worker, although reported to the Commission, was not in our jurisdiction. They were an employee of the Department of Health and Human Services in Victoria.
Okay. Senator Davey, did you want to ask some questions?
Just a few on that. You said you've had 354 workers or participants nationally who have had COVID. Have you got the state breakdown for that figure?
Yep, 324 relate to Victoria. 23 relate to New South Wales, 4 in Queensland, 2 South Australia, 5 in Tasmania.
And you said at the peak you had 130 active cases. That was the peak during the second wave in Victoria. Were those 130 all in Victoria or were they?
That's right. I think it was a little more than 130. I don't have the exact number. I think it was 136. But that was all in Victoria.
Right. And while we've heard that the published action plan was published on the 16th of April, and you've been at pains to explain that there were already plans and actions being undertaken. It just hadn't been consolidated into one. And you've also said that in August in Victoria you really ramped it up to your twice-a-day meeting, 7 days a week. But what preparatory, and I think this is where Senator Gallagher was trying to go, once we saw a second wave coming in Victoria, which was in June, what actions and activities were taken to respond to that and in preparation of what might have been coming to ensure the continuity of support for participants. It's been too long.
So I think we've referred, and happy for my colleagues to chip in at any point here, but we've referred to really having a 2-pronged strategy where the NDIA was responsible for working with participants and the regulator was responsible for working with providers to make sure that we were doing proactive outreach, that we were communicating the situation regularly, we were collectively monitoring data and infections, we were engaging regularly with our counterparts in the Victorian government. The Minister announced a series of policy changes, including things like access to PPE in response to feedback from the sector. Collectively, all of us at the table, as well as many people from our teams, have been engaging with the sector in the broad, providers, peak bodies, to understand what issues were being experienced on the ground and to respond accordingly. For example, the PPE. When we were hearing ongoing issues about access to PPE, we did intensive work with the Department of Health about access to the National Medical Stockpile. When there were problems about funding PPE, the government announced changes to pricing to allow those things to be claimed under the NDIS by both participants and providers. So a series of kind of actions have been underway to make sure that participants are getting the services that they need, and likewise that providers are aware of and complying with their obligations.
And as in terms of the residential care and science, you've said there, in Victoria there's about 5,000, 50-50 in state.
Roughly, yep.
Roughly. Mm-hmm. What extra activities were taken in those sites to make sure that people were safe and got adequate care, but in a safe and COVID-safe way?
So again, for providers, and my colleagues in the Commission might want to talk specifically about the actions undertaken with providers, but it's really been about making sure that providers are aware of what the public health orders require of them, that they were aware of best practice around PPE and infection control, that they were aware of and meeting their reporting obligations, and that they were safely managing the passage of people in and out of those facilities. There were also some work done around alternative accommodation arrangements in the event that people in those facilities test positive, that we could move residents in and out as we needed to. So a whole series of things, again, focused on making sure that the providers continue to deliver essential services, but do that in a way that manages risk to participants.
And so of the 324 Victorian cases, excuse me, how many of those occurred within a residential facility?
In total, have you got that number somewhere?
Yeah, there were 38 participants and 107 workers in residential.
So why has there been a difference in the occurrence and spread of the 5,000 residents in the NDIS system compared to what we've seen in aged care facilities during the second wave?
One of the biggest differences is the nature of the facilities. So a residential service in a disability context has somewhere usually between 4 and 6 residents, so they're small, compared to a residential aged care facility which can have 50, 100 more than. So, once it gets into those much larger facilities, then it's a much bigger problem. So I think that's a fundamental difference in the nature of the system. There is also, the levels of risk are also different. The age and comorbidities of people who are in aged care, not always, but can, as a cohort, means that they are in a very high risk category. That is sometimes true of people with a disability, but not universally true.
And when you've got a higher number of workers in working in residential facilities than participants who were infected, would that indicate that the protocols that are in place, preventing workers attending work when they've got symptoms or sick is actually working, because...
Yeah, I would say that would suggest to me that the mechanisms in place and the guidance about how to manage workforce in the context of, say, the Victorian community transmission was taken very seriously and applied well by disability providers. So the transmission level is obviously quite low, and we're very pleased to report that there are no active cases of participants, for example, in Victorian residential centres today. So I think, as Ms Rule said earlier, the sector has really responded very well and really, done a good job at risk assessment and putting in place the various things that they've been suggested to them by both local health authorities and from the point of view of the provision of disability services by us and the NDIA.
Just to build on that, perhaps when we look at it site by site, it's actually only a small number of sites where we have had both participants and workers reporting infections. You either have sites where it's been a worker or participants, but not both. There are some, of course, but the fact that that is not the predominant means that protocols to prevent worker to participant transmission, while not universally successful, have been rigorously applied, and I just add endorsement of the way the sector and many providers have stepped up in this time.
And so does that mean the plan published in April, but maybe updated in August?
July. I've got it.
July.
It's the 17th of July.
Will that be updated again going forward, and are we going to remain at a sort of at high alert going forward until, as a nation, we're more confident that we have containment?
I think that's right. I mean, we've talked about the very intensive engagement with Victoria, but we are also engaged directly with each state and territory in that preparatory sense, taking the learnings from Victoria in the perhaps unlikely now, but still possible event of significant outbreaks in the other jurisdictions. And so, the protocols and the establishment of the working groups bilaterally, state by state, is in place.
That's all I have.
Okay. Thank you very much, Senator Davey. In terms of, are you the right, I don't know, maybe it's DSS, the $24.5 million for ADEs, is that your area, the Australian Disability Enterprises, through the Temporary Viability Support Program?
It is. I don't have any information on it with me.
It was part of, just to make sure it's part of the terms of reference, it was supporting Australians most at risk in the wake of coronavirus.
I will have something here somewhere, but it's probably reasonably high level, but I'm happy to...
I want to know whether it's gone, the money has been made available.
I'll see if I can find out before the end of the hearing, but happy to take the question on notice. I just don't know the answer.
Okay, because there was also some money to extend the supported wage system supplementation to them, to the ADEs, and up to $61 million available to disability employment service providers as an advance payment of 6 weeks on service fees to ensure participants continue to access support during this time.
So that payment was certainly made.
Okay.
So it was a one-off viability payment that has been made.
So that's the $61 million one?
Yeah.
Can you check on the supported wage system and the...
I can. I've just asked somebody
It's also a temporary viability support program for the ADEs. Yeah.
I'm certainly aware of the payments. I just can't answer the question.
And the phone line. I think there's $2 million to establish.
Yep. So the phone line, I can tell you about. The phone line's been established.
When does that?
When was it established? I'll check the date of the announcement, but I can give you some data on call numbers. So to date, the helpline's received 3,132 calls. It's done... 3,132 calls. Yep. It has provided 645 web chat sessions and made 2,114 referrals to other services.
And that's over how many weeks, sorry, has that been operating?
Since it was announced, it was stood up about a week or so after it was announced. I'll just check that announcement date for you.
So April.
Yeah, so since April, yeah.
April. Okay, if you could, I think we might be finishing a bit early, so if you can take that on notice,
Of course.
that's fine. I've just checked with other senators whether they have questions. Finally, just going back, Mr. Head, to the questions I've had about convincing yourself that the regulatory approach is working. When I was just reflecting on the answers you gave, and it seems very provider-initiated focused, like you're relying on the provider to either to self-report or to provide you with the information. I'm just wondering how you're assuring yourself that the people receiving services are, I guess, aligning with the view that perhaps providers, and do you have like a risk register of providers that you probably do a little bit more checking on, or more vulnerable recipients who might require a different approach from you? I say this having worked in the disability sector for many years before politics, so I really understand the residential and, living alone vulnerability of people who require support, and that's the bit that remains a bit unanswered for me about how you're assuring yourself that you're getting a recipient's view of what's going on.
So both Ms Taylor and I will answer parts of this. I mean, I think that it's been important for the Commission. I mean, COVID-19 arrived when really we'd only been operational in 5 of the 7 jurisdictions we're in for a little over 6 months. So we're still in an early stage of interacting with providers. That's why a formal mechanism around notifications was put in place, because where we become aware of that can result in quite serious compliance action, and Ms Taylor has been monitoring that. I think Ms Rule pointed out that there's been quite significant engagement with the sector, and that includes peak groups, but also we've done quite a lot of direct outreach to participants, as well as organisations representing people with disability, to encourage people to let us know when they're observing particular problems with services related to COVID-19. The other thing to observe is that the triage process around notifications allows for us to really form a view about whether or not there's a problematic pattern occurring, and we get other intelligence through other parts of our system, reportable incidents, more general complaints about a provider. So it is the case, I think, that there's been a very specific focus. Yes, it does require providers to notify us of certain matters, but I think providers are increasingly aware of the level of direct engagement we have with the information they're providing us with. There's a lot of follow-up by our staff. There's also been a lot of work liaising not just with the peak industry groups, but with the Commission talking directly to significant providers about things that we are observing. And this is all happening during a time where, notwithstanding your earlier questions, where the sector is very aware that we have compliance activity on foot in respect of a number of major areas of activity. So providers are acutely aware, I think, of the fact that the Commission is examining a wide range of matters, including things that relate to COVID. I don't know whether you want to add to that.
Well, I will add one thing. We've been looking at our, to the extent that there is in this period, usual activity, particularly around complaints coming in about broader matters, as well as the incidents that the Commissioner referred to. And we've seen no change really in the patterns of those. So part of the important part of us getting information about people's experience is through that complaints mechanism, and really the numbers of complaints that we've been receiving about things that are not specific to COVID hasn't diminished, hasn't dropped off in any way. So that's been a really important piece of intelligence for us. In Victoria, for example, that all through this period people have been complaining and drawing issues to our attention about general matters, although about 10% of the complaints in Victoria over the period have related specifically to people's experience with COVID-related matters. But it's been
And so have
very
complaints
steady.
gone up during that time from March to now?
No.
I mean, it's hard because you're new, isn't
Quite
it?
steady.
It's quite stable, but we're
okay.
careful about making claims about complaints because we've operated in 2 states for more than, well, now we've operated in 7 for slightly more than 12 months. But we don't really have data that allows us to make reliable year-on-year comparisons, and won't until we've been operating longer. But what I would say is that in addition to what I've said and what Ms Taylor's said, during the period of working on COVID, the Commission's also been working to increase its data analytics capability. So now that we're further through the process of transitioning providers in, we're more able to devote effort into those things that will give us much richer regulatory intelligence about either particular problems we're seeing in the sector or the behaviour of particular providers or classes of providers that are providing particular kinds of supports.
And do you have anything to do with, I don't know, in my day it was advocacy organisations that, like self-advocacy or people-centred advocacy, I don't know what the correct terminology is these days, but that type of service that, you know, gives a voice to perhaps those that aren't able to pick up the phone and make a call or, you know, send you a message another way. I'm just, again, wondering how you reach those people.
So part of our early engagement with the sector, but it's become a feature of the work we do, is that we, so far we've run 2 summits for advocacy organisations around the country. I've briefed groups of advocates in states and territories as we've been doing the rollout of the Commission. We have, as I've said, our sector consultative bodies, which include people who have deep and broad networks in respect of people who are doing both individual and systemic advocacy. And we make resources available. So I think there is quite a high level of awareness now amongst advocates of what the Commission's functional remit is, where it's up to in its operations, how it can receive complaints. There are, of course, aspects of the way we do complaints management where we encourage people to utilise advocates or to be aware that they can have an advocate in that process. So the one-on-one process between the Commission and an individual complainant often deals with the issue of advocacy for that person.
And so do you feel like the circumstances which have been brought to the public's attention around Ms Smith, do you think that you've made the necessary changes that would not allow a situation like that to occur again without you having some red flags?
So one of the first things we did in respect of that situation is one of the compliance activities we're talking about, where in fact people are receiving support in their homes for daily living activities. We used our notice powers to gather information on a range of practices that could point to greater risks of neglect, and that information gathering exercise and interaction with over 2,500 providers is informing the current compliance action. So we did not wait for Mr Robertson's review to look at that particular issue, and it's an example, I think, of where there is a significant compliance activity on foot at the moment, which may result in regulatory action, but where that won't only include those things that relate to breaches, but also those things that relate to improving practice of providers. So,
so you feel like you've done everything that you could do to address the risks that were identified in that case?
Well, we are working through some of Mr Robertson's recommendations too. We've established the dialogue with the NDIA around data sharing, etc. So we've taken, I think, very comprehensive action in respect of the circumstances that relate to the Commission's regulatory remit in relation to the regulation of providers of those types of supports.
Okay. All right.
Senator, I have some
sure.
information now for you.
Thank you.
Apologies for not having that at hand.
No, that's fine.
So advance payments to disability employment service providers, a total of 45 providers have accepted $36 million in advance payments.
That's of the 61? Yeah.
Yep, and the number's lower because not all providers took up the offer. So we had allocated an amount and
So 45 providers, did you say?
45 providers up to $36 million we've paid out. So that money's out the door.
Yeah.
We've provided $19.3 million to 129 ADEs through the Temporary Viability Support Program.
Yeah.
And we've also provided an additional $3 million to extend wage supplementation through the supported wage system.
So that $3 million has gone?
It has, yes.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
And so it's just a little bit of an underspend in the ADE?
In the DES one, the Disability
DES.
Employment Service Providers.
Okay.
So,
Yes, in that one, 36 versus 61, but in the ADE one, it's 19.3 out of 24.5. So it's a small...
yes, that's right. And again, it was up to ADEs to ask us for the support if they needed it. And so that reflects the uptake from the ADEs.
Okay. Just finally, before you go, the making some of the information public around the number of infections of COVID-19, I think the Minister Robert started publishing data on the 19th of August, a daily figure. Yes. Is that your area or is it... So, yeah,
yes.
Okay. So what... I guess why did it start on the 19th of August? Was this as a result of some of that coordination work or...?
Look, it was really a decision for the Minister, but I think it reflected rising requests for information from the sector advocates, the media. The Premier in Victoria had started to specifically mention particular cohorts in some of his daily stand-ups.
That's right.
And so the Minister felt that it would add to the story to put the numbers out about disability NDIS participants. Yeah, and that's right, Martin, as Martin just said, be reassuring that the numbers actually are pretty good.
And is there a reason why you haven't you didn't include deaths as part of that data?
Because the numbers are really small. We're conscious of people's privacy. When you're in, kind of standard protocol on data is usually when you're talking about numbers less than 5, you don't publish because it allows people to be identified. So we were just conscious that data is quite sensitive and difficult. But
and my understanding is it excludes NDIS participants in aged care or self-managed participants. Is that right?
Those numbers are... So the aged care numbers are reported in the aged care
even
context.
though you're an NDIS recipient in your aged care?
Yeah.
And self-managed participants, is that...
So I'll just clarify there. So a self-managed participant has the ability to use registered and unregistered providers.
Yeah.
If they were a self-managed if they are a self-managed participant and they only use unregistered providers, there is no hook for the reporting obligation to get to the Commission and us. But if they are a self-managed participant using a registered provider, then the reporting hook is still there. So we've done some estimates the scheme actually looks at, and it's a relatively small increment that you would expect statistically from that.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator.
I'll just check final call around. I think everyone's okay. Thank you very much for appearing today. We do appreciate it. I think there was a few things taken on notice, so we have a rule of 10 working days. But if that's if you need to seek an extension on that, the committee stands ready to talk with you. But other than that, we look forward to seeing you again another time. The committee stands adjourned. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator.
Thank you.